Taking back Sinjar. With intense coalition air support, Kurdish forces fight to free a key city from ISIS. Search for answers. Investigators sift through the wreckage of a small jet that crashed and burned in Akron, Ohio. Not so glamorous. Glamour Magazine's picks for Women of the Year ignite a social media firestorm. And Misunderstood Martyr, a profile of Blessed Oscar Romero, the Salvadoran Archbishop killed while celebrating Mass. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, November 12th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. It would be a major strategic victory to retake the Iraqi city of Sinjar near the Syrian border from ISIS. Kurdish fighters supported by U.S. airstrikes are closing in tonight, but the fight is far from over. Coalition airstrikes have been going on for weeks. There have been 36 in just the last day. With continued coalition support, thousands of Peshmerga fighters begin a ground offensive to take back the northern Iraqi town of Sinjar from the Islamic State. Sinjar is situated on an important highway and was overrun by ISIS in August 2014.
You'll recall about this time last year, we were all facing the horror of what was happening in the vicinity of Sinjar to the Yazidi people. A year later, Kurdish forces, some number of thousands of them, have launched into the attack to push Daesh out of that area to cut Route 47.
Route 47 connects the ISIS-controlled city of Mosul in Iraq with Raqqa, the group's stronghold in Syria. The Pentagon says retaking Route 47 is critically important.
This is a specific effort to target this one supply line, this critical supply line between Raqqa and Mosul, that we think, if it is indeed severed, would have an impact on ISIL and its operations, particularly in Iraq.
By late Thursday, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters had retaken some of the small villages surrounding Sinjar. They control a portion of Route 47, but military experts say to expect a long fight to retake Sinjar itself.
Going from house to house, where you can't use the American air support, where you can't use artillery, where you can't use mortars, gives the advantage to the defender. So it may be a couple of hundred against 7,000, but in my mind, ISIS could continue this fight for quite some time.
We'll discuss the Yazidi and Christian communities under siege in Iraq a little bit later on. Meanwhile, other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Twin suicide bombings in Lebanon kill at least 43 people and injure many more. A Lebanese official calls it one of the deadliest attacks in years. The explosions, minutes apart, happened outside a Beirut mosque and inside a bakery. The area is a stronghold of the militant group Hezbollah. No one has claimed responsibility yet. Only minor injuries are reported after gunmen riding a motorcycle opened fire on an evangelical church near Cairo. Egypt's official news agency says the attack set off a gun battle with police. The 3 attackers escaped. Attacks on churches and Egypt's Christian minority are rising as tensions with the Muslim majority group grow. A Jordanian police captain who killed 5 people this week is buried today. Among victims of the shooting at a police training center were 2 Americans. Thousands of mourners chant "Death to America, death to Israel" at the funeral for Anwar Abu Zaid. It is unclear if Zaid had political or personal motives, but his family insists he was not an extremist. Jordan's government is saying little about the shooting. California's death penalty survives a legal challenge today. A federal appeals court reverses a lower court ruling that found it unconstitutional because of long delays. More than 900 people have been sentenced to death in California since 1978. Only 13 have actually been executed. Federal investigators combed through an Ohio crash site today. They're searching for the cause of a chartered jet crash into a residential neighborhood. Mark Irons reports.
All of a sudden, this plane just dropped out of the sky. It just veered sideways and just plowed right into the duplexes.
The devastating moment of impact as a small jet crashed into an apartment building in Akron, Ohio, and ended up slamming into an embankment. The jet took off from Dayton Tuesday and was on approach to land at Akron-Fulton International Airport when it clipped a telephone line. 9 people on board, including 2 crew members and 7 passengers, died in the crash. The jet was operated by Florida-based company ExecuFlight. The CEO says the pilots were well seasoned.
They like to fly together. We monitor the flights leg by leg since it started, and it's typical for them to give us a doors open and door closed message. We've got them all.
A relative of one of the victims feared the worst when news broke.
We knew she was on a small jet that was traveling around the country with her company on business, and I texted her after I saw the news report, and she didn't reply. And between the siblings, we started doing some detective work and made some calls and checked some flight plans and kind of put two and two together that it was her.
Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Let us pray for those souls. Pope Francis delivers a message to Slovakia's bishops. Receive migrants with charity and respect while upholding the law. The Holy Father addressing the church leaders who are on pilgrimage in Rome. He expresses appreciation for what the bishops are doing to support the family, which the Pope says is subject to many dangers. The Pope also emphasizes young people need clear instruction on doctrine to build the city of God and in this city of man. We have Dr. Chad Pecknold, a theology professor at the Catholic University of America, and Mary Rice Hasson, who directs the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Chad, we now have an unofficial translation of the final report. A British bishop put this out. It's being called accurate and dependable. How do you see it?
Well, it is an unofficial translation, and I think we need to understand that the Synod final report isn't addressed to us, and that's why we don't have an official translation. Synods are advisory groups. The Second Vatican Council was very clear that synods do not have magisterial authority. They're sort of like the church's town hall meeting, and the results of that are presented to one person alone, and that is the successor of St. Peter.
And Mary, how does this report really build on the rich teaching of the Church on Catholic marriage and family life?
Well, actually, it's a big improvement over the working document because it really draws in Scripture, the writings of Vatican II, the writings of John Paul II, and of Pope Benedict as well as Pope Francis. And it's important to understand kind of the structure. What the bishops, the Synod Fathers did was the first part of the document kind of looks at the landscape. What's the reality of families' lives? And then from there, it's as if they're saying, okay, what now? Some of this looks kind of dark and difficult. And so they say, we've got a compass, and that compass is Jesus Christ. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And so it just goes from there and weaves in Scripture, tradition, and we see the richness of the Church's teaching.
I can't wait to read the whole thing. There are 3 paragraphs. They're kind of vague. They're concerning to some people that the Church may be looking at changing doctrine on marriage. What do you make of those paragraphs, Chad?
Look, there's already been more ink spilled on those 3 paragraphs than on the whole Synod document. I think we need to keep the whole Synod wisdom in mind. Read where the parts where we see that Jesus Christ is the moral compass. Read about the complementarity of men and women entering to the vocation of marriage and the vocation of the family. These are the clear passages which we use to interpret the ambiguous and obscure ones, and that is what the Holy Father will do as he receives this wisdom from his brother bishops.
A quick look at the documents that have been leaked from the Vatican. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, there's so much about greed, aren't they? They're about money and how we misuse money, and sin in the Church is not infrequently to do with money. Even the German bishops that are seeking liberalization and change, so much of that is driven by their dependence on the church tax. And I think that's about greed, and the Holy Father, I think, wants to purify us of that.
And Mary, there is resistance to the reforms. That was expected.
Right, but much as you're saying, it's driven by sin. And in this document, there's such a call to conversion for us. And so we see the same thing. We see that what Pope Francis is about is reform. And just as we as individuals need that continual conversion, so does the Church. The Church needs that continual reform because it's made up of sinful people. And so we see the beauty of the Lord leading not just us as individuals, but leading the Church.
Very exciting times in our church. Mary Rice Hasson, Dr. Chad Pecknold, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Top Mexican officials say Pope Francis will visit the Mexican capital and 3 states early next year. Francis will make stops in Chiapas, Michoacan, and Chihuahua, as well as Mexico City. The official says the trip will happen early in 2016, but the Vatican will not release a schedule until next month. Mexico is home to more Roman Catholics than any other Spanish-speaking country. Benedict XVI visited Mexico in 2012. German police prevent refugees without passports from boarding ferries to Scandinavia. This as Sweden suspends the European Union's passport-free travel rules, trying to control the flow of migrants. Swedish police urge people traveling to and from neighboring countries to bring passports or some other form of identification. This poses a major roadblock for migrants hoping to reach Western European nations.
No passport, no document, German, no go to Sweden. It's problem to no sleeping.
Nearly 200,000 asylum seekers are expected by the end of the year. Sweden is receiving more refugees per capita than any other EU nation. Meanwhile, EU leaders are discouraging people from coming to Europe looking for work. They're also seeking ways to send thousands of Africans who don't qualify for asylum back to Africa. At a summit in Malta, EU leaders are drafting migration agreements with individual African nations. The day after Veterans Day, a former Army captain is awarded the nation's highest military honor. Captain Florent Groberg and 5 other soldiers were on a security detail in Afghanistan about 3 years ago. As Catherine Szeltner reports from the White House tonight, a deadly ambush began to unfold. Catherine?
Brian, Captain Groberg is only the 10th living American to receive the Medal of Honor for service in Afghanistan. To his family and friends, the 32-year-old is better known as Flo. It's clear from his interviews and the award ceremony today, he is one humble soldier.
You know, you're going to ask yourself, why am I here and they're not? And that's a tough question.
Born in France, Florent Groberg is now an American hero. On August 8, 2012, the U.S. Army captain tackled a suicide bomber while serving in Afghanistan.
You just react, and you trust your instincts, and you go out there and you do what you're trained to do, and you do your job.
Groberg saved many soldiers, but not all.
Next thing you know, I got 4 guys who are not here today. I got 4 families that don't have a father, a son, a brother, a husband.
Flo's courage left him severely wounded. His injuries include loss of nearly half his left calf muscle, a blown eardrum, and a mild traumatic brain injury.
I'm here. I'm talking to you. I'm telling the story, and they want to give me a medal for it. Medal doesn't belong to me. It belongs to those 4 guys.
3 years and 33 surgeries later, the Army captain receives the top military award at the White House.
On his very worst day, he managed to summon his very best. That's the nature of courage, not being unafraid, but confronting fear and danger and performing in a selfless fashion.
Always carrying the fallen soldiers with him, Captain Groberg now has a new mission.
Live your life now, not just for yourself, but for them. Be a better person. You're given a second chance. Earn it.
Captain Groberg is retired from the U.S. Army now. He's said over and over his Medal of Honor is for those soldiers who did not make it out alive. That is how Groberg copes with their loss. Brian?
Catherine Szeltner at the White House. Thank you, Catherine. Coming up.
Genocide. That's what this new report says is happening in the Middle East. I'm Jason Calvi. I'll have that story coming up.
And we take you on a thrill ride with the Navy's Blue Angels and their airborne photographers. Today, November 12th, is the feast of St. Josaphat, Bishop and Martyr. As a 17th century Archbishop of Ruthenian Orthodox Lithuania, he worked to bring his countrymen back into union with the Holy Father. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Glamour Magazine's Women of the Year Award sparks controversy. Olympic athlete Bruce Jenner, who now says he's a woman named Caitlyn, took center stage. The recognition of Jenner and Planned Parenthood President Cecile Richards is drawing backlash on social media. Sue Ellen Browder is with us, a contributor to the National Catholic Register, author of a new book, Subverted. Sue Ellen, what does Glamour honoring Jenner and Richards, what does that say to pro-life feminists?
Well, this is a slap in the face to pro-life feminists, because this honoring of Richards is telling women that abortion is good for them, and they've been told for years that that baby in the womb is just a clump of cells. And now this, but it doesn't surprise me because, I was once part of that group think, in Washington, in Manhattan. I used to work for Cosmopolitan Magazine in the heydays of the sexual revolution, and I was part of the problem.
Well, you know that they had an agenda. What is the agenda of Glamour here, and who's behind it?
The agenda of Glamour is that the right to abortion was inserted into the women's movement in 1967, and they're still perpetuating that right. It was inserted into the women's movement on November 18th, 1967, in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., under the influence of two men who wanted to make abortion legal. And Betty Friedan bought into their priorities, and that night, even though she was against abortion, she never mentioned abortion in her feminine mystique, and she said that abortion was not what she thought choice was. She said it was much more important for a mother to be able to choose to be a mother. But that night she inserted abortion in the women's movement, and there were only 57 people there that night that voted for that. There were about 100 people in that room. 57 people voted for abortion, and 1/3 of those feminists, those ardent feminists, walked out that night and later resigned over the abortion vote. So what we're seeing here with Glamour is clinging to that pro-abortion right that is no longer needed and no longer wanted.
So as an experienced journalist who is in the middle of all that and knows how it came about, what would you say to the editors of these women's magazines today?
I say get out of your Manhattan bubble and wake up. Things have changed. It's time to rethink this whole thing, and this time, let's get it right.
Sue Ellen Browder, a contributor to the National Catholic Register, and we look forward to reading your new book, Subverted. Thanks for joining us by Skype tonight.
Thank you.
And a new report accuses the Islamic State of a genocide against religious minorities in northern Iraq. The charges come from eyewitness testimony. Jason Calvi brings us the story of these groups.
I want to tell my son, where are you? I miss you.
Caliph follows the ancient Yazidi religion. Johanna is a Christian. They both fled the Islamic State in their native Iraq. Naomi Kikoler met them on a fact-finding mission in Iraq. She compiled her findings in a new study.
They talked about going to bed and having dreams where they are simply terrified because they're reliving moments of having had to flee the Islamic State.
The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum put out the new report today. It's part of their promise to make sure what happened 70 years ago is never again.
Holocaust survivor Margit Meisner is here.
This is appalling that this is happening again, especially since it is done in broad daylight.
Dakil Shamo is a Yazidi who lives in D.C. He was waiting for the report, which calls the massacre of his people a genocide.
It was the moment that we, all the Yazidi community in the entire world, waiting for.
The report says Christians suffered crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. Kikoler says the people she met described painful stories, as well as their hopes to return home one day.
To be sitting there with people who've lost everything and to see such immense graciousness and such hospitality was a both humbling and very moving experience.
Photos of the victims of ISIS are illuminating D.C. this week. A silent appeal for help. Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Powerful story. Thank you, Jason. Also tonight, we want to give you a viewpoint few people ever get. We strap into the back seat of F-18 fighter jets with photographers who capture the U.S. Navy's Blue Angels in action. Hold on. All in a day's work means traveling at speeds of up to 700 miles per hour, flying in daring formations separated by feet, even inches. For the photojournalists with the U.S. Navy Blue Angels, they have to go to extreme lengths to get their job done.
You have a viewpoint that no other photographer, except you or the other Blue Angel photographers are going to have.
Flying in F-18 Hornet fighter jets, the Blue Angels wow spectators with intricate formations at top speeds. And capturing the death-defying and iconic images are petty officers like Katie Holm, chosen for a 3-year tour of duty.
It's a crazy roller coaster. I don't know, or steroids. A roller coaster on steroids is how I would describe it.
During demonstrations, the pilots and photographers can experience 7.5 times normal gravity during acceleration, climbs, and turns. The G-forces make a 10-pound camera feel like it's 75 pounds.
I think that's helpful to be so focused like through the lens and not really worried, I guess, about what's going on outside the plane, whether the ground is above your head or whether you're spinning in circles.
Unlike fighter pilots, Blue Angels pilots and photographers do not fly with G-suits designed to keep them from fainting. So they must learn breathing techniques and stay physically fit to avoid passing out during high G maneuvers.
I'm actually one of the few that has, I claim, I brag that I never passed out and I've never gotten sick, never.
But even the most prepared can't avoid a little motion sickness.
I can definitely say that I have gotten sick quite a few times in the jet.
I have gotten sick afterwards, and I have definitely passed out.
But to Blue Angels photographers, it's a small price for the perfect shot. Up next, a unique cross given to Pope Francis by Cuba's Raul Castro finds a new home in Lampedusa, Italy. And we profile the life and martyrdom of El Salvador's Blessed Oscar Romero. As Christians, we are called to imitate the Good Shepherd and to help families experiencing difficulties. From the Twitter account of Pope Francis today, thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Pope Francis thanks a religious order founded by an Italian priest for working with the poor, the disabled, and the sick. The Holy Father receiving the Don Guanella Servants of Charity in the Vatican. They're celebrating their patron, Our Lady of Divine Providence. Francis says their founder's faith was based on total trust in God. When faced with poverty and injustice, the Pope says we all need to look at the world with hope and love. Pope Francis donates a unique crucifix gifted to him by Cuban President Raul Castro. Made from wooden oars, it will be given to a parish on the tiny Mediterranean island of Lampedusa. The island receives many of the migrants and refugees crossing from Libya to Italy. The oars and ropes symbolize the reality of migrants who have made that dangerous crossing. And Pope Francis challenges believers to never renounce our faith in Christ, even if it means giving up our very lives. His comments come as the Holy Father reflects on the life and death of Blessed Oscar Romero. Wyatt Goolsby joins us now with that story.
Brian, Pope Francis calls Archbishop Oscar Romero a martyr for the faith. He says since his death, though, Romero's been martyred over and over again by people who slander his name. The Holy Father is setting the record straight. Archbishop Oscar Romero speaking out against the violence in his native El Salvador. This is how millions remember the man Pope Francis calls a good pastor, full of love for God. The Holy Father recently praised Blessed Romero while meeting with pilgrims from El Salvador. The Pope saying Romero lived the Beatitudes. Blessed Romero was assassinated in 1980 while celebrating Mass in a hospital chapel, one day after calling on the government to end their violation of human rights against the population.
It is now 34 years later, pretty clear that he was assassinated by a right-wing death squad, and that his sermon was in some ways the final straw.
Jeff Thale has studied human rights issues in El Salvador for decades. Thale says tensions couldn't have been higher when Romero was killed. The country's civil war, which started in 1979, pitted the military-led government against left-wing guerrilla groups. Thousands who spoke out against the government on immigration and land reform issues simply disappeared. Thale says for years, Archbishop Romero was focused on being a pastor, not wanting to get involved in politics. But after seeing many innocent people die in El Salvador, he felt compelled to speak out.
Archbishop Romero was not there calling for revolution or whatever. Archbishop Romero was calling for respect for human rights and for attention to the concerns of the poor.
Leonor del Carmen Chacon and her husband were married by Romero in 1963. She still has lots of keepsakes.
I feel happy. I feel proud that we were friends with a saint, because for us, he was a saint from the beginning. For us, he was a humble saint.
For Leonor and many Central Americans, Romero will always be remembered as a voice for the voiceless. In February, Pope Francis formally recognized Romero as a martyr, which cleared the way for him to be beatified in May. Romero still needs a miracle in order to be declared a saint. Brian.
Thank you, Wyatt, and thank you for joining us. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night. God bless you.